Time now to join Frank O'Callaghan for the next instalment of the series Dundalk's Radio and Television People. Part 13. Terry Sloan joined Reynolds Electronics as financial controller in the early 1970s after working in GEC in Dunleer. Terry talks about the entrepreneur Pat Reynolds, originally from Killashandra, County Cavan, who had worked in America before joining GEC. Nordmende sets were imported, modified and tuned and sold to dealers throughout Ireland. Terry recalls that the VAT rates were very high at the time and the Christmas market was make or break for both manufacturers and dealers.
So, continuing the series of programmes on Dundalk's television and radio people, on this occasion we're talking about the company Reynolds Electronics, who manufactured televisions and radios in Dundalk from about 1971 to somewhere in the mid-1985s. I'm delighted to say that with us in the studio we have Terry Sloan. Terry, you worked for the company during this period. Do you mind telling me what sort of a task you had? What were your jobs?
Thanks, Frank, and it's good to be here. I started with Pat Reynolds around early 70s. I had worked in GC in Dunleer, and I had seen that Pat had started the place in Bachelor's Walk, as it then was. And then by the time I came to him, he had moved up to Stapleton Drive, which is basically where the Tesco building is sitting now. And I went in there as financial controller, which is a grandiose title. Basically, you were the credit controller, you were the accounts, you were fundamentally doing anything to do with the finances. I would have had colleagues there, Damien Halfpenny, who still lives up around Castlebellingham, Kilsarn, that sort of area. Jerome Panisi, who was the sales guy. There was a guy called Frank Bourne. I don't know if you ever heard of him. And a good guy, a great guy. And they were the sort of initial core people, you know.
It makes all the difference, doesn't it, when you have a good team of people and people who get on with one another. It's the same in life in general, you know. Tell me a little bit about Pat Reynolds, the person and the professional.
As I say, I had come across Pat in GC previously, but only just to sort of say hello to or whatever. Pat was a lovely guy, a gentleman, I have to say. And I don't mean this, I mean this in a pleasant way, maybe slightly eccentric in a little way, because he was an engineer, I think, by trade, and he was setting up this company, which was a complicated enough thing to do, you know. But anyone who met Pat would tell you he was a good guy, very pleasant man.
Was he a hard taskmaster?
No, he wasn't. He wouldn't be. Going back to the style of people that he had, he was getting the best out of us all anyway, because the type of individual that were working there, it was a small team and everyone was doing their absolute best all the time. So Pat didn't need to demand anything of us, really, you know. But the company, by its nature, was a hard taskmaster, if you understand. There were a million things to be done all the time.
Pat had family. Can you tell me a little bit about the family?
Yeah, Pat's wife was Joan, and I'm going from memory on this one. He had a son, Sean, and another one, Patrick, I think. And I think his daughter was called Karina. I found out, luckily from my own point of view, about Pat's funeral on the evening beforehand. And I went over to Killashandra to that, and I briefly spoke to them all over there.
Is that where he actually came from, Killashandra?
Pat came from Killashandra, yeah. I think the family had a small shop, I'm guessing post office, I think, in the town.
Where did he work, going back to Pat, where did he work before he started this business of his own? What was his professional background?
As I said previously, GC certainly. He worked in the States at one point, and I can remember one story that Pat told, if I may, about, it was the difference between, say, the US and here. He was, wherever he was based in the US, he had to go off for a few days, maybe a week, to work somewhere else in another branch or something. And when he came back, he was coming back home to where he lived, and he suddenly thought, I'm lost, I don't know where I am. And the reason was, in the week he was away, they built a 6-lane highway. And, that would have taken 3 years in Ireland at the time. Yeah. And that's a fact. I remember him telling me that. He couldn't get over the efficiency.
So there must have been thousands of people lost at that occasion.
Oh, well, exactly.
Terry, what would you consider the biggest success of the company?
The leading thing in the company was the Nordmende 26-inch colour television. Now, if I can go back a little bit first, the products that they were doing when I came on the scene were 2 little radios. One called the Joy radio, which was a tiny little thing, and the other one was called the Playmate. Now, they weren't German, they were Hong Kong, if I remember, products. Pat would go to Hong Kong, source all that sort of stuff. He would buy the kits, the components precisely, and the casing for that. And they would be manufactured, they would be put together in the thing. And they were the only thing. That's what the company was doing at the time. They were maybe doing a thing called a 3-in-1, which was a big deal at that stage. Radio, cassette and record player. I mean, it sounds nowadays, very plain, but it was a big deal then. But the main 2 products were those 2 radios, the Joy and the Playmate. What happened then was he got the agency for the Nordmende product, which, as I said, the biggest one was 26-inch colour television. Now, the financial implications of that were enormous, because you're selling the Joy radio probably for, I don't know, maybe £4 or something like that, and the Playmate maybe £12 at that point, and you were selling the Nordmende colour television for £340. So the financial implications in buying the product in the first place were enormous, and the banks in those days wouldn't be as flahool as they proceeded to be much later on. They were run very, very tight, and Pat, it was almost impossible to get finance to do the thing. Now, what was happening with Nordmende, it's not that you paid for the stuff at the time, but you had to have a bank guaranteed bill of exchange, which was the same thing from our point of view. Yeah. And I remember very well, there was a new manager in a particular bank in Dundalk, and Pat and myself went up to see him. We had accounts and projections and all sorts of stuff. And this man was unique. He had an unusual approach to the whole thing. So we sat down and we gave him the projections and the accounts, and he threw them to one side. And he said, "Sure, what do I know about these things?" He said, "Everything's anyway, Pat." And he chatted away about this, and there's good drink in the Imperial these days, and all sorts of stuff like this. And then he'd say, "I suppose I'd better ask you something about these blasted things. Your head office, they'll be on my case." And he'd ask Pat a question, and he'd throw it aside again, and right, that's enough of that, carry on. And then he'd go on and talk about what else he was doing. And by the end of the meeting, he'd asked us every relevant question on those accounts. I really admired it. He was brilliant, and so we were looking for 20,000 of a facility, a guarantee facility. Now, his discretion in the bank at the time was 3,000. That's what his discretion was. That's what he was allowed to deal with. I remember he looked at us and said, "Am I a clerk or am I a banker? You have it." And he gave us 20,000.
Yeah. And just to take you back a bit now, you said £300. Was that your cost of bringing the product into Ireland, or was that your sales price?
No, that was the price to the dealer. It was about £340, I think, at the time. It was probably £240 or something coming into us. I'm going from memory again.
And then going to the dealer, it was about £300, £340.
Yeah.
And then there was more money. The profit margin was on that.
The dealer put that on. It was probably selling at £400.
But that was huge money back in
that was big
that
bucks. Yeah, it was. going back to the bank, if I may, we went back down to the factory, which at that point was in Jocelyn Street. It was R.F. Martin's old building there in Jocelyn Street. We went back down and we got a phone call. The guarantee of 20,000 related to 100 televisions. So they were obviously coming in at 200 each. That was what it was. So we went back down, and a company called Everclear Television in Terranure in Dublin rang, and they bought the whole 100 televisions. Right? So
all in one purchase.
All in the one go, yeah. So our guarantee facility, we needed another 100 immediately. I went back up to the bank and into this particular manager who was a well-known character. I said, listen, you know that guarantee of 20 grand? Yeah, I do. We need another 20. And there was a bit of colourful language, and we got the other 20. So he had, on one day, given one company 40,000 from his discretion of 3,000.
And tell me, Nord Mende, how would they have accepted that sort of movement of the product? That was huge, was it not?
It was, I suppose, the Germans were quite phlegmatic, I suppose. They wouldn't tip their hand very much. Whatever went on. But they were delighted, of course, with that, with 100 sets being sold like that. No, the whole thing took off very well. There were lots of customers came on board looking for stuff all over the place,
The money didn't frighten them off.
No. I'll tell you what happened, Frank. The summertime would be downtime in the television game. Come September, October, November, when the Christmas demand started, the whole thing would just go. Yeah, it would go mad.
Just to clarify for the listeners' sake, a couple of wee words on Nord Mende, because you mentioned them a few times, and they were quite renowned in this time. Like, as far as I can establish, the original company was called Radio and Mende, GmbH, was founded in 1923 by Otto Hermann Mende, who passed away in 1940 in Dresden. But following the destruction of the plants during the bombing raids in 1945, his son, Martin Mende, created a new company in Bremen in 1947. The name was subsequently changed to Nord Mende, and the company became one of the prominent German manufacturers of radios, televisions, tape recorders, and radio players in the 1950s and the 1960s. So a company like Pat Reynolds did very well to be able to align themselves with Nord Mende, who one of the leading manufacturers of the product of the world, really.
Yeah, I think it was a happy coincidence of timing that Pat was just really getting going at the time when they were looking for an outlet in this part of the world, and Pat was a charming man, so I've no doubt that he got on very well with them. The salesman we were dealing with was a gentleman called Adik Breedendick, lovely guy, and he used a phrase which I had never ever heard before. You might ring him on a Friday, and he used a phrase which is now common in this country, but I'd never heard it. And he would say, "Hello, Mr. Sloan. Good, yeah. TGIF." No idea. Thank God it's Friday. And now it's common. And yet in those days, this is the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
But it was common in
the Germans were
at that stage.
They were a little ahead of us sometimes, weren't they?
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you about something here, and I'm probably off the wall altogether. But this tariff thing with President Trump at the minute. Yeah. Was there a tariff thing back then? Or maybe I should say, did the government give out grants for manufacturers to produce product so the Irish people would be employed?
No, quite the contrary, in fact. It's an interesting, you bring up a very interesting point. As I said there, the television was coming in at about £200 at the time. But the VAT on it, coming in at the point of import, was, I think from memory, 36.75%. 36.75%. Okay? So by the time we had it in, it was costing the guts of 250 quid. And then you were selling it on to the dealer or whatever, and that's where the price climbed. But so it was good money for the government. Now, at that time, the border was a great place, and it was a great place for people. I mean, there were cows dizzy going over and back the border. Well, of course, what would happen was, at that point, animals, not just cows, but animals would be exported. And because they were being exported, whatever duties or things on that were waived at the customs. But they were only getting as far as Jonesboro, more or less. And then they were coming back up the back roads and in. Now, what happened then, one or two enterprising gentlemen, not from Dundalk, I should point out, but started buying televisions for export. And because of the export thing, the 36.75 was waived. But the televisions were coming back in and being sold to southern customers at a fraction of the price that the guys could sell. And it caused chaos, I have to say. The customs got involved and there was all sorts of stuff.
Just a word, Terry, about how difficult was it for a company, typically Reynolds, to actually make profit, make money back in that time, with all that you're after saying there about bringing product in from Hong Kong or wherever, in Germany and all these places, and then the VAT rates, and how difficult was it to make money?
It was difficult. Money was always tight, and the reason being, of course, there were so many companies in the market. You know, we were doing Nordmende, then Telefunken, AG Telefunken were another brand. Sony, of course, Philips, I think I heard mentioned. Ferguson, of course, was another one. And Pi. You know, and various different places were, you know, in competition and cutting the margins. So your margins were never what, yeah. And as you alluded to earlier on, it was an expensive product in the first place. So for such an expensive product, what you were getting out of it was relatively small, really, you know. Yeah.
And tell me something too about your customer base. Were the individual shops down the country? I know you mentioned that somebody bought a batch of them, but how did the system work really?
Oh yeah, we had a few reps. There was a gentleman in the Midlands called Eddie Keegan, who was a rep with Pat pretty much from the start. Good fella, Eddie, good guy. A man called John Breen, who actually, very interesting, I was at a golf tournament the other day and there were Tipperary people playing, and I asked him, because John was a very keen golfer, was he still around? And he is still around, although maybe in failing health, but good guy, liked him a lot. He was the southern counties. A guy called Dominic Farrell covered Dublin.
Tell me something about your great memories what's your great memories?
Jerome Panisi was our sales rep, and he met a guy called Sean Gilson from Tullamore. And Gilson was, again, a character. And he insisted that Jerome goes to the pictures with him. Honest to God, they had lunch and then the pictures. And sure, Jerome went along with it. And the pictures was Jaws, okay? Now, I would always be at loggerheads with Sean Gilson looking for money. And the shark appeared and Gilson said to Jerome, "There's Sloane." And that's sort of carry on. It sounds mundane or bland now, I suppose. But it was great crack in those days. The characters in the game around here were the dealers. Some of the dealers were around here, and interestingly enough, there was, and again, I'm not going to name names, but there was one particular dealer. He was having lunch in a local hostelry, sandwich and a pint, out in the countryside. And a man came in, and we'll call this man Johnny for the sake of it, the dealer, which wasn't his name. He said, "Johnny, you let me down." And Johnny looked at him and he said, "How do you mean he let you down? What do you think I'm doing here? Are you here to look at? Of course I'm here. I'm here having my pint and my sandwich and I'm on my way down." "Oh, I'm sorry about that, Johnny. I'm very sorry." "Forget about it. That's no problem. Are you going down to the house now?" "I'm going down now." "Right. How are you travelling?" "I'm on the bike." "Grand. You go on. I'll be down in the van in 5 minutes. I might even get there before you. I'm sorry again. That's no problem. Off he went. And Johnny looked round the bar and said to the customers, anyone know who that man is? And that's, I promise you, that's a true story.
That's the way we'll be left.
Yeah.
I have to ask you the question, I suppose, that coming to the end here. What actually caused the closure of the factory, Terry?
As it happened, thank goodness, God forgive me, but I had left to start up my own operation a couple of years before that. And the fact was that one particular dealer got into Reynolds for, I think, close on $250,000, I think, and hit the skids. And that was that. No, I think they struggled on for a year or two later on, but I think it was never the same after that, you know.
Very hard to recover at any time, particularly back then.
Exactly, you know. And it was sad, you know, it was very, very sad.
You said a lot of nice things, incidentally, about the man Pat Reynolds, but given all that he went through, building up a business, educating himself, I'm sure, dealing with foreigners, dealing with banks, dealing with lads like you, and all this other stuff, how would you summarise the person at the end of this programme? I
think that, fundamentally, Pat was a decent man, and you can't get away from that. If he had a flaw, and I say this purely in business terms, he was oriented towards sales. And sometimes he would maybe buy a product that he shouldn't, or give credit that he shouldn't, or whatever. And that hurt him a bit in the end. But Pat was a decent man. I liked him a lot, and I wouldn't have a bad word to say about him. But so that was the story of Reynolds Electronics.
Well, I have to say, Terry, that was a most valuable contribution to the programme, and it was eye-opening in many respects. I mean, we very much appreciate you coming in and sharing your stories, because these are the important things to put down on records. And these records, through the programming of Dundalk FM, will be with us forever. And your contribution was invaluable, as I said. Thank you very much.
That, Frank. Before I go, I just want to mention a thing. It was a thing called the intermittent fault. And maybe I've mentioned this to you off record previously. A television would come into the repair area in Reynolds, and it would sit quietly on the floor for, it could be a couple of weeks, because it'd be a very busy operation. It'd be coming and going all the time. And then the dealer might ring, what about my set? Or even worse, the customer might ring. I sent a television set back there, and he went, oh, you won't believe this. There's an intermittent fault in it. We had it on the bench going perfectly, and all of a sudden it sat down again. What the poor old customer didn't realise, the television set had sat in the box from the day it had come back for the previous 3 weeks.
Never said a word.
And that was the intermittent fault. It came to the rescue of many a repairman, let me tell you.
What a way to finish.
Yeah.
Good man, Terry.
Terry Sloan, Financial Controller at Reynolds Electronics, in conversation with Frank O'Callaghan about working with TV dealers all around the country and how the company relied on the Christmas market for survival. In the next programme, Stephanie Comiskey, Nee McCann, and her brother Noel McCann talk about their father's business at 22 Clanbrassil Street. Jack McCann was a keen cyclist, having learnt his trade in London, and his shop was an electrical and cycling shop. He was an agent for Pye, Bush and Philips TV and radio.